program. Doug's a native with deep roots here in Western North Carolina. Before he retired to Little Switzerland on the mountain. He had a career doing historic preservation work and a second career in finance. So he's going to speak to us tonight about the well-known patriot in McDowell County. So I'll leave him as far as speaking with us back on.
Thank you, Charles. I am also one of the newer members of the chapter here. I am so new, in fact, that my hat only arrived in the mail a few days ago, and I have one question. Does my head conform to the hat, or does the hat eventually conform to my head?
Yes,
Neither? Neither, because it's as hard as a brick, you know. So I need a tip there.
It's a 5-minute arm workout.
All right. I sort of rushed the beginning here. I'm sorry to start while you're still eating, but I fear I have too much material. And so I'm going to proceed just as quickly as I can. And if anybody feels the need to get up and leave, I won't be upset about that. Do what you need to do. So, we ready to go? The morning of November 7th, 1827, in a clearing by the road that descends through the Saluda Gap in South Carolina, 2 shots ring out in rapid succession. Dr. Robert Frank Vance falls to the ground, mortally wounded. The shot that felled Dr. Vance was fired by Samuel Price Carson, son of John Carson of Pleasant Gardens. Vance and Carson met on the so-called field of honor, following the rules for settling disputes between gentlemen known as in the Old South as the Code Duello. Vance, shot in the abdomen, was carried to a nearby inn where he lingered 30 hours before passing away. Carson's friend and fellow Congressman David Crockett was present at the duel. As soon as the outcome was clear, Crockett mounted his horse and raced to Pleasant Gardens to report to the family. According to one of the Carson children, Crockett rode his horse almost to death, beat his hat to pieces, and came dashing up yelling, "Victory is ours." As reported in the Western Carolinian 2 weeks after the incident, and I won't go through all of that, but they reported, we can report as a fact, that Dr. Vance is dead. And the unfortunate controversy that resulted in this duel grew out of the late election for Congress in the district. So, what was the unfortunate controversy that resulted in the duel and the death of Dr. Vance? That, of course, is the subject of tonight's presentation. For the controversy actually had its seed in an event that transpired almost 50 years earlier in the summer of 1780 at the height of Western North Carolina's involvement in the Revolutionary War. Our plan for this evening is to examine our subject from 4 perspectives in the hope that we might get to the root of it. The duel, the life of John Carson, Carson's revolutionary service, and how the word is pronounced, or how we know what we think we know. And I want to pause just briefly and make sure everybody does know that this is the John Carson who is associated with the Carson House in McDowell County. So similarly, as you folks have the McDowells and the McDowell House. In McDowell County, we have the Carsons and the Carson House. And the histories are intertwined, as you know. So let's take a quick closer look around the circumstances around the duel. Robert Vance was the son of revolutionary patriot David Vance, who of course lived here in Burke County and then after the war resettled up to Buncombe County. Robert Brian Vance was born at the Reems Creek home, and which is now known as the Vance birthplace. For someone growing up in western North Carolina at that time, he was very well educated. He was educated as a physician. He was made wealthy through inheritance and also the good fortune of winning a lottery. And once he became wealthy, he gave up being a doctor and decided to go into politics. He was elected to Congress in 1823. His opponent in the duel, Sam Carson, son of John Carson, and his second wife, Mary Moffett McDowell Carson. And you know that Joseph McDowell Pleasant Gardens was married to Mary Moffett. And Joseph died in the mid-1790s. And John Carson's first wife died in the 1790s, and so then they got together, and Mary Moffett McDowell came up the road and married John Carson, was his second wife. So Sam Carson was the first child of John Carson and Mary Moffett. He was born in 1798. He was something of a golden boy. He was handsome, charming. He was admired for his singing. He loved to go to the camp meetings with his mother, and they said he was a good singer. He read law under his brother, Joseph McDowell Carson, and he ran for Congress in 1825 against Robert Bright Vance, and he won. He was age 27 at the time. So, in an attempt to regain his seat, Vance ran against Carson in 1827. During that heated contest at a political rally, likely no more than 500 feet from where we are tonight, here in Morganton, Vance declared, "In the time of the Revolutionary War, my father, Colonel Vance, stood up to fight, while my competitor's father, Colonel Carson, skulked and took British protection." The charge lit up the room like an incendiary. Sam's brothers in the audience had to be restrained from rushing the stage. Sam, however, maintained his composure, and he won the election. But the incident was not forgotten. A family meeting was held at the Carson house, and it was decided that Sam would respond to the challenge, and that if he fell, he would respond with a challenge, and if he fell, his 5 brothers, one after the other, would pick up the challenge. And if they all failed, then the old man, their 75-year-old father, would answer the call. Vance's assault on the family honor was that serious. On September the 12th, 1827, a month after winning the election, Sam penned the challenge letter. In Shakespearean tones, he wrote, "The malignant shafts of your disappointed ambition fall perfectly harmless at my feet." Dueling had been outlawed in North Carolina in 1802. to circumvent the law. The challenge letter was routed through Jonesboro, Tennessee. And as we saw, the duel itself was fought outside of Saluda across the state line in South Carolina. So, we have the proximate cause of the duel, the grave insult to the Carson family honor, hurled in the heat of a charged political campaign. But how about the original event, John Carson's conduct during the Revolutionary War? Was Carson a true patriot, or doth the Carson family protest too much? I am descended from John Carson, and so the question is personal for me, and it's something I've wondered about most of my life ever since in the 7th grade. I wrote a term paper on the Battle of Kings Mountain, and reading Draper, could not find a reference to Carson fighting in the momentous battle. Why was he not there? Was he, in fact, guilty as charged, a skulker? So, who was this man, John Carson? John Hazard Carson was born on March the 24th, 1752 in County Fermanagh, Ulster Province, Ireland. He was the youngest son of James and Rebecca Hazard Carson. We know very little of his childhood and early years in Ireland. In June 1773, at the tender age of 21, Carson joined one of the great migration streams of the 18th century, sailing from the port of Londonderry on Ireland's northern coast for the American colonies. Londonderry was a leading port of departure for the Scotch-Irish immigrants from Ulster. Its ships were part of a trade network linking Ulster's linen economy with colonial America. Flaxseed came east from the ports like Philadelphia, while linen goods and immigrants sailed west. By the eve of the American Revolution, tens of thousands had already passed through Londonderry's quays, carrying Ulster Presbyterian culture into Pennsylvania, the backcountry, and the southern colonies. The total number to leave Ulster for the colonies between about 1718, 1715, and 1775 has been estimated at 250,000. Conditions were harsh. Passengers were usually crowded between decks with low headroom, poor ventilation, limited light, and real danger from disease, storms, and shipwreck and privateers. The crossing was not travel. It was a gamble undertaken by people seeking land, opportunity, religious freedom, or escape from economic pressures in Ulster. Carson booked passage to Newcastle on the Delaware River south of Philadelphia. His passage cost somewhere between £3 and £5, roughly $750 to $1,250 in modern purchasing power, but a far heavier burden in terms of an 18th century worker's wages. Apparently he or his family had the money, as there was no indication that he indentured himself to finance the journey. Tradition holds that he immigrated with a sister and her husband, a Wilson. Carson landed in Newcastle in September 1773, implying a crossing of 8 to 10 weeks. He then traveled north into Pennsylvania, spent about a year and a half exploring opportunities up there. Apparently he found the area a little crowded, or he heard of better opportunities down on the southern frontier. So in May 1775, he boarded another ship in Philadelphia and sailed to Newburgh. And from there he traveled directly to the western North Carolina frontier. Why he sailed to North Carolina rather than traveling overland through the Valley of Virginia, no one knows. One can imagine, though, this was a man on a mission. Having identified the southern frontier as his target, he went there as directly as he could. His route suggests urgency, mobility, and perhaps an eye for opportunity. He was not moving a household, he was moving himself. And he arrived on the frontier just as war began to loosen old political boundaries and open new possibilities for land, for alliances, and advancement. I am willing to bet that many of you here tonight have tried to imagine that virgin landscape that greeted the pioneers as they traveled to the edge of the known world. To the boundary between land available for settlement and what was temporarily at least reserved for the Native Americans who had lived lightly on that land for millennia. There's a lot that we don't know about Carson's early years in the Carolina backcountry. Here's what we do know. He arrived just weeks after tensions with Britain ignited a full-blown revolution, a fighting war, and the revolution must have strongly colored the life that he led in those first few years. We know that colonial authorities had closed the land offices in 1773, frustrating those anxious to stake claims for land out on the frontier. We know that the newly independent state of North Carolina restarted the land grant process at the end of 1777, and Carson entered his first claims early that next year, 1778. So we can say his first land claims were also a political act. They depended on recognizing the authority of North Carolina's revolutionary government to make grants of land that until recently had been controlled by the king and his authorities. What was momentous for Carson, we suspect the McDowells took a liking to their neighbor and fellow Ulsterman and took him under their wing. He married into the family, taking Rachel McDowell as his wife in 1778. Rachel was the daughter of Hunting John McDowell. And so he gained as a brother-in-law and friend Rachel's brother, Joseph McDowell, Pleasant Gardens Joe. When John and Rachel's first child was born the next year, they named him Joseph McDowell Carson. For the sake of time, we'll skip ahead and reflect on the fact that by the time he died in 1841, Carson was one of the area's wealthiest men. How did he make his money, we might ask? A survey of the surviving record would say he took advantage of all the opportunities that circumstances presented, and they were many. He was a farmer at scale with thousands of acres under cultivation. He raised and traded cattle. He ran a store on his property. He speculated in land. He operated a mill on Buck Creek. He did both milling and distilling. He was one of the first to aggressively enter the hospitality business in this area. And lastly, even at an advanced age, when gold was discovered in the South Mountains in the late 1820s, he participated in the local gold boom. We can gain a window on some of Carson's business activities by examining the pages of his surviving plantation journal. This is a wonderful document. So, what do we mean by trade? Carson operated a store on his property from the 1790s on. The Plantation Journal provides a wonderful perspective on that trade, and I'm going to skip right over to this transcription. So on the 2 pages, on one side he said, This is the credit that was extended to the local fellow, Martin Davenport. The only place that Davenport shows up in Pfeiffer's history is he did have a military record. He was one of the captains of the militia. That's the only thing I could find. But so Carson made a loan to him. He provided him with sundries. There's a reference to another accounting book where those sundries are detailed. Provided 2 bushels of salt. The total that Martin Davenport owed him was 31 pounds, 10 shillings. Now we note that in 1795, he's still working in pounds and shillings. Now, of course, that stands to reason because we only started minting American dollars in 1792. So we were early in the transition to American dollars. All right, so on the other leaf of our notebook here, contra credit, you see at the top. These are all the things that Martin Davenport used to pay off this debt. It gets pretty interesting here. These are the trade goods on the frontier: deer skins, venison hams, a horse, a bear skin, sang root, beeswax. Again, back to the transcription, just a lot of wonderful information here. It's easy to come up with equivalent or relative values. One deer skin was equal to a venison ham, was equal to a pound of ginseng root, was equal to a pound of beeswax, and those were all worth 1 shilling and 6 pence, which would, in today's dollars, would be about $5. A horse, about $1,000. A bear skin, 5 shillings. I forget what that was. But anyway, so to pay off his debt, Davenport delivered all of this to Carson's store. He came in with a surplus, and because Davenport paid him more than he owed, that Carson then paid back to his son William 21 pounds, 5 shillings, and that was signed off by William. And his cattle trading activities. This is for 1 year, 1821. Let's go back here. All right, so in the year 1821, Carson bought 75 head from Avery, 21 from Sam Davidson. You can see down the list, bought a total of 139 head, added 20 that he raised himself, 159 total head, at an average cost of $23.37. Then he sold them for an average sale price of $36.47, amounting to $5,800 in profit. Amounting to $5,800 in income. The profit is $2,551, less the cost to drive them to market. And so that profit is about $70,000 in today's terms. And remember, that was just one of his enterprises. And how did he get them to market? Well, he had one of his men, or a couple of his men, drive them down to Charleston to the market. So that wasn't all that expensive.
Were they slaves?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we'll get to that. But land speculation, these are all of some of his early surveys. He started accumulating land. Of course, he used that land for farming and for cattle raising, but he also speculated in land. His land speculating activities peaked in the 1790s during a time when he was particularly active in newly formed Buncombe County. And somebody was talking earlier about the state of Wilkes. Well, they also referred to Buncombe County as the state of Buncombe. It was one of those mother counties that started out very big. The state of Buncombe. It extended to the latest Indian boundary and beyond. Carson bought land in Buncombe on his own account. He took others for tours on the frontier. You see this, kind of looks like towers, but it's actually tours. This was long before Webster had standardized things. In 1795, he managed to convince the governor that the Buncombe County entry taker had been playing shenanigans. And the result was that a number of large land transactions were voided. The way Carson handled himself during this episode so impressed one of the big eastern North Carolina land speculators, John Gray Blunt, that he signed Carson on as his agent. And Carson worked with Blunt through the 1790s until most of the big land tracts had been bought up out west. All right, moving on, just quickly, hospitality. I'm sure you all heard that Carson House served as a stagecoach stop and inn. I'm convinced that Carson built the house close to the intersection of roads with an eye towards commerce. We know that Carson's son and heir to the place, Logan Carson, expanded the house and ramped up those activities in the decades before the Civil War. We do not know how early they began, certainly in the 1820s, by the 1820s, but we do not know how many years before that. Carson was an enslaver. Every enterprise he pursued benefited from the leverage the system of enslavement provided. Whether it was clearing land, working in his fields, taking his cattle to market, tending to the guests at the Carson House, operating his mill or gold mining, in every situation, he could employ the labor of people he owned rather than paid. I do not think Carson had second thoughts about slavery. Like many of his fellow frontiersmen and women, he saw it as a boon to his prospects, and he embraced it. By 1790, the year of the first national census, and so the first year for which we have records, he already enslaved 12 souls. Scan the census schedule, and it's clear he was already one of the largest slaveholders in Burke County. Look just above his name, and you'll see that his neighbor, Joseph McDowell, had also bought into the system, owning 9. And so it went. By the time Carson died in 1841, he owned 68 individuals as reflected here in his estate inventory. There is a strong oral tradition among black Carsons that John Carson fathered a number of children with Cadella, an enslaved woman. Although we cannot confirm the specifics, nobody wrote those things down, DNA provides irrefutable evidence that somewhere along the way, a Carson man or men did father children with those they enslaved. Carson was blessed with a long life and a large family. His first marriage to Rachel McDowell lasted 16 years and produced 7 children. After Rachel died, he married Joseph McDowell's widow, Mary Moffett. They were married for 28 years and together had 5 children. He died in March 1841, just days from turning 89. Carson was neither a philosopher nor a politician, certainly not a writer nor an orator. Out in the back country, however, all the prominent men seemed to have their turn, and so despite his shortcomings from time to time, civic responsibility was thrust upon him. He served as a local magistrate more than once, a member of the North Carolina House of Commons. To my thinking, however, the apogee of his public service came in 1789 when he was elected to represent Burke at North Carolina's Second Constitutional Convention. As you may recall, a year earlier at our first convention, North Carolina had declined to ratify the Constitution for lack of a Bill of Rights. Carson attended the second convention in Fayetteville in November 1789, along with both Joseph McDowells, Charles McDowell, and William Irwin. Only Quaker Meadows Joe, a die-hard anti-federalist, voted against ratification that time around. Carson voted with the majority for North Carolina to join the Union. This imaginary scene is intended to represent our Burt delegation in animated conversation over libations in a tavern in Fayetteville at the end of the day after a day of debate over the Constitution. Can you pick out Joseph McDowell? So let's move on to the heart of the matter. Carson's activities and allegiances during the Revolution. I apologize to you. I probably developed much more material than I should have for an after-dinner speech like tonight. But again, if anybody feels like they need to get up and go, that's fine. I'm going to go just as quickly as I can. Carson's activities and allegiances during the Revolution. As we've noted, Carson arrived in NC and made his way to the frontier at the very moment the conflict was ignited. The timing was almost breathtaking. He boarded a ship in Philadelphia 1 month after Lexington and Concord. He landed in New Bern in late May. It was as if, as he was strolling through New Bern, he could look over his shoulder and see Josiah Martin abandoning Triumph's palace and rushing off to the safety of Fort Johnston. He would have arrived on the western North Carolina frontier in June 1775, about the time of Bunker Hill. Less than 6 months after arriving on the frontier, he joined a militia led by Captain William Moore, Governor Dan Moore's ancestor. At the time, the unit was part of the 2nd Rowan County Regiment, because it was only a year or so later that Burke County was formed. Early in 1776, Moore's unit headed to eastern North Carolina as part of the Cross Creek expedition. I'd like to pause on this engagement because I find it fascinating. The rebellious colony had only been on a war footing for about 6 months at that point. And yet the rebel government and its military leaders were well enough organized to put out a call that was heard and heeded by militia in the westernmost part of the state. I think you know the background of this episode. Governor Martin was hoping to regain control of the state by rallying the loyalist Highlanders around Cross Creek to join forces with British regulars who were sailing towards North Carolina's coast. But as Carson says, before we got down to Cross Creek, the Tories were defeated at Moore's Bridge and all deserted, so no fighting done by us. As a reminder, the Battle of Moore's Creek Bridge was fought on February 27, 1776, and of course it is important that the Loyalists were defeated because it ushered in several years of relative quiet in the state. Carson was proud of the fact that his fellow militiamen elected him ensign for that campaign. Ensign being the highest non-commissioned officer in the unit, who probably served as Captain Moore's right-hand man. And in those days, your fellow militiaman elected who would be the ensign in the unit. To give ourselves half a chance of getting through the rest of this tonight, let's talk about these 4 bullet points together. The Battle of North Fork, the Rutherford Expedition, the Second Cherokee Expedition, and service at various frontier forts. What all these have in common, of course, was that they involved action against the Cherokee. The existence of the proclamation line added an extra layer of meaning to the revolution in the backcountry. Most folks had arrived out here on the frontier eager to acquire land. The existence of the royal boundary was frustrating those ambitions. It is said that many joined the fight in the expectation that independence would open up more land for settlement. And of course, Shelby, Sevier, and many others didn't wait, but bargained directly with the Cherokee over the mountain, which didn't sit well with royal authorities. And of course, the Cherokee themselves decided to take the conflict as an opportunity to push back on the tide of settlement, with Dragging Canoe and his warriors opening a second front along the southern frontier in the late spring and summer of 1776. J.D. Lewis, on his wonderful Carolina.com website, shows a concentration of Revolutionary-era forts on the North Carolina frontier. And of course, they were there because of this second front that was started by the Cherokees. As many forts as he noted, we're pretty sure Lewis missed a few in our neighborhood. Ann Swan has attempted to catalog them all, and we put them on this map. I know that Ann relied on William Brown's research. John Carson served tours in at least 4 of these forts. And despite a series of punishing raids into their territory by various militias, the Cherokees remained an active threat throughout the Revolution. In the fall of 1781, for his last tour, Carson joined General Rutherford's Wilmington expedition, a campaign aimed at driving British forces from their last stronghold in North Carolina. Cornwallis had retreated to Wilmington after Guilford Courthouse, then marched to Virginia, leaving Major James Craig to hold the fort. Carson served as forage master for the expedition. Before the militia reached Wilmington, Rutherford received a dispatch saying Cherokee attacks threatened the western frontier again. Or, as Carson put it, the Indians broke in on the frontier. In response, Rutherford ordered Carson to double back, drop off some prisoners in Salisbury, and then gather a rear guard to defend the home front. So, for a second time, Carson's effort to join a fight in the east was thwarted. Carson participated in a couple additional campaigns, no major battles, but these are the major elements of his revolutionary service. What's missing? There's no mention of the Over Mountain campaign or Kings Mountain. And there's no mention of serving the patriot cause by taking protection. So I'm left to wonder, is it possible that as Ferguson made his foray into the backcountry, did Carson in fact lose heart and become offensive or worse, a closet Tory? All right, last section. Remember, what I mean by how the word is passed is basically how we know what we think we know. Of course, for an explanation, that would take a while. To make some progress in our remaining time, I suggest we look at 2 key documents that purport to set out elements of Carson's revolutionary service. The most obvious is his pension application. Everything that I have told you about how his revolutionary service came from that document. As you know, Congress did not authorize pensions for regular militiamen until June 1832. Carson filed his application the next year, December 1833. At the time, he was 81 and drawing on his memory of events that took place 50 years or more earlier. Think about that. So, there he was, a very interested party. He wanted a pension, making his case based on very distant memories. And his sworn statement was notarized by McDowell County Magistrate James McDowell, basically his adopted son. What could go wrong? He did the best he could. And his application was initially pension office came back asking for additional information. His reply, I don't know what more I can say. You've got it all in front of you. And please keep in mind the special nature of service on the frontier, where a tour might be spent scouting the mountains looking for signs of charity activity, or traveling to backcountry farms and homesteads, keeping his ear to the ground. I find his pleading a sad state of affairs. John Carson begins to take on the aspect of the Rodney Dangerfield of militia. You just don't get no respect. Carson was eventually awarded a pension, but only posthumously. The award was dated April 1853, 12 years after his death, and the accumulated sum of approximately $850 for the 10-year period between March 1831, and his death in 1841 would have been paid to his surviving children. If we were to leave the story here, Carson, age 82, pleading his case with the pension office, no vindication in his lifetime, this would be a sad tale with many unanswered questions. Please allow me to bring one more perspective to bear. I think you will find it interesting. In 1799, a commission was created to establish the official boundary between North Carolina and Tennessee. The location of the line had been controversial, and so trusted figures were appointed to conduct the survey. Representing North Carolina were none other than Joseph McDowell, Quaker Methodist, and David Vance. McDowell would have been 43, but in poor health. He was finishing up a term in Congress. Vance was about 54, and as we noted earlier, living on Greens Creek in Buncombe County. He had lobbied for the creation of the county and was serving as clerk to the county court. The other members of the survey party knew they were in the presence of true heroes of the Revolution. And so they asked McDowell and Vance to provide a full account of the Over Mountain campaign. They agreed to do so on the first wet day that should happen, when they were out surveying. On the wet day or two, McDowell and Vance held forth with their first-hand accounts. They are still retrospective narrative accounts, not military field notes. But we are hearing from participants who were in a position to know what was going on. And they were drawing on much more recent memories than what it would have taken to piece together a pension application. 19 years versus 50 plus. Vance, who was known for his beautiful penmanship, acted as the scribe. How are we doing, Tom? You all right? Here, reading directly from Vance's written account, Ferguson's main business was to kill the Whig stock, their cattle, which would give time to raise an army of volunteers over the mountains. Colonel Charles McDowell proposed they who could not go over the mountains should take protection on the advance of Ferguson and thereby save the Whig stock. Some absolutely refused and stated that instead they would drive the Whig stock into the deep coves under the eave of the Black Mountain. That others might take protection and save the stock that remained behind. John Carson, William Davidson, Ben Davidson, and others were appointed to take protection to save the remaining Whig stock. And as if this isn't vindication enough for John Carson, there's more. The news came that John Carson had played a subtle trick on Ferguson. Basically, he led a party of loyalists to a herd that was owned by men who were in Ferguson's camp, rather than rebels. And those cattle were slaughtered. This turned the Tories rather against Ferguson. Von Ferguson stated that the rebels had outwitted him, and that he could not effect his purpose there, and he would start back to Yorktown. The Indians were expected to fall on the frontier as soon as Ferguson left it, and it was agreed that Smith, Lytle, and Jay McDowell would remain at the head of the river, as they were considered equal to a small army against the Indians, and that they should have those who had taken protection to assist them. So there we have it. Carson was appointed to take protection. He tricked the Tories. It was agreed he should join those staying behind, i.e. not join those gathering over the mountain, in order to protect the frontier from expected Cherokee incursions. If any of this sounds familiar to you, it is because Lyman Draper included a summary version in his Kings Mountain and its Heroes, published in 1881. Draper actually had the original manuscript, which had been preserved by one of the surveyors and handed down in his family. In 1891, Vance and McDowell's account was finally published in a small pamphlet, seen here. But it had very limited circulation, and it was only 2 years ago, through the miracle of the internet, that I came across a copy. Not that I purchased, but that it was published to the internet. As you might imagine, I was very pleased to find it. We should not overlook one final irony. It was none other than David Vance's son, Robert Frank Vance, who called John Carson a skulker here in Morganton in 1827. David Vance had passed away in 1813. One can only wonder what inspired his son to make that charge. As Sam Carson said, it must have been ambition. John Hazard Carson died at his Buck Creek home on March 5th, 1841. He was buried atop the landmark Round Hill in the Pleasant Gardens bottomland, once owned by his father-in-law, Hunting John McDowell. As memorialized in the markers erected by their descendants, he shares that burial ground with other Carsons and McDowells from the pioneering generations. I do not know what Carson thought about the big issues of his day. He did not commit those thoughts to paper. By his actions, though, we know he was committed to the American dream of seizing the opportunities that lay all around him on the Carolina frontier. And I will gladly accept the testimony of Joseph McDowell and David Vance that puts him on the right side of the fight for freedom. Right, and of course, the reason they called the state historic site Vance Birthplace the Vance Birthplace is because Zeb Vance was born there. He was an uncle of Robert Frank Vance. You have that right? Zeb Vance was the governor. He was the governor. He was an uncle to Robert Frank Vance. Yeah. In other words, Robert Frank Vance had a brother whose son was dead. Yes, sir.
I have a question. What do you know about what was going on in 1778? One of my patriot ancestors was at Fort Davidson under Joseph McDowell in 1778, and I haven't found a lot other than Indian affairs that was going on at that time.
In John Carson's pension application, he simply refers tours at the fort. And that may have been one of the weaknesses in his application. You know, like I said, he was out there looking for signs of Indian activity. They were there John Carson did build the Carson house. We have the record of where they paid to have the cellar dug in 1793. And it was Carson's move-up house. He had had at least one other house, maybe a couple of other houses. But it was his move-up house. And like I said, I think he picked the location near a crossroads because he had something in mind. He wanted to take advantage of that. The house that we see today, it's the same house, but it doesn't look the same. Because when Carson died in 1841 and left it to his youngest son, Logan Carson, in the 1840s, Logan Carson did a total remodeling of the house. Added the third floor, added those double-tier porches on the front, and remodeled it in the more stylish Greek revival style. But underneath what you see today are still the log ends of the house that John Carson